Devlog 6. Today's devlog is going to be a fun one because it's something that I've been dreading tackling, and that is enemy AI. Now, making any sort of AI for a video game is bound to be difficult. So as a developer, you have to make sure that 1, it works, 2, it's fun to defeat, and 3, it's not aggravating. Now all these points I'm going to be keeping in mind as I continue developing the project. So now I'm going to dive into how I started making AI for the game. Initially, I was going to make the AI completely in the actor's blueprints. For me, this was the best way of doing it because I felt pretty confident in my ability to make the AI with just blueprints. However, with further and extensive testing, I realized this may not be the best idea. So the problem with the AI and the nav mesh was that it was only working if the player was on the ground. Anytime the player would be in the air, the nav mesh and the enemy AI would just stop and just not follow the player. The second problem was that the player jumped behind the enemy AI, it would just stop and completely forget where the player was. Now to an extent this makes sense, but not to the extreme where the enemy just stops completely. Finally, I ended up fixing it, and I decided to do it the right way, because if I want to make more enemies in the future, which I fully plan on doing, it's going to make it a lot easier if I make it this way, in the correct way. So with all that said, I decided to end up biting the bullet and making AI the way you're supposed to. I first decided to start from scratch and research about how Unreal handles AI properly. I watched hours of videos and read possibly what felt like hundreds of forums and documents to fully comprehend how Unreal handles AI. So I didn't need everything I read right now, but in the future it's definitely going to be helpful. So Unreal uses something called behavior trees, which is exactly what it sounds like, but I'll explain it here. The AI always has a default task that it will always do, and the AI can have different tasks and actions that can have different priorities, and they're all ranked from left to right based on importance. So what I ended up doing was making the default slot of the AI to roam around the area, which I tied to a set value that ranges from 0 to 1500. Then I made a task that activates when the AI spots the player and then will then move towards the player. Once the player is spotted, the player will have a few options: run away, jump over it, attack, or even stun the enemy. I made it to where the newspaper launcher will allow the player to stun the enemy for a few seconds before the AI goes and follows the player again. Now if the player is out of range, the enemy will go back to roaming around the area. However, if the AI is close enough to the player, then it's going to attack the player. Obviously the AI isn't really that smart, and it's more or less just a dumb basic AI, but for me, I count this as a win. So now I have the core of my AI working, so I should definitely add some art and models, right? No, I shouldn't, because art is the last thing that I should be worrying about right now. I caved. I made art. But Aaron did make some amazing art for the enemy that I wanted to make. Now I'm going to censor some things because it's going to spoil part about the story that I don't really want to show you, but I'll show you a few pictures. I have 2 variations of these enemies, one that attacks you by stabbing the player with its little nose, and another one that'll spit out this purple goo at the player. Now right now I only have the attacking enemy, just to get a basic feel of the AI, but of course the model I'm using right now is just a placeholder until I make the final model and textures. I also held off on making any animations for this guy because I feel like I'm going to replace the model anyway. When the enemy attacks, it will deduct 1 health point from the player's health. Once Gooby has been hit 3 times, he's going to die. However, I also added these power cells to act as hearts or a health pickup for Gooby. Also, just to mention, the UI is nowhere near final. I just kind of put it in there just to say that, hey, it works, and that the hurt system and the health system actually works. So all I have to do later on is just make it look pretty and presentable. With these enemies, Goobies can spin attack them and kill them. They aren't really meant to be very difficult, they're just meant to spice up the gameplay and just make the game feel more alive. Right now, there isn't any incentive to kill the enemies, so they might end up dropping a power cell or something valuable to encourage fighting them. You can also shoot the enemies to stun them for a few seconds. But that's it for the AI. I've also made some big improvements from the movement from the last devlog, which is something I really like to focus on. So one thing I wanted to fix was Gooby's rotation rate. So whenever Gooby's running speed is less than 800, his rotation rate will be 3000, and anything above 800, his rotation rate will be 800. This gives Gooby a more realistic way of running, and it generally feels a lot better than it does before. Another thing that I also added in was Gooby's squash and squish to Gooby's jump. I think this makes Gooby's jump feel so much more impactful. Now I know he is a robot, so he shouldn't really squash and stretch, but it does look a lot better, so I might have to think of a reason in the story why he can stretch as a robot. In the last devlog, the shooting was also different because you had to hold down the trigger to aim and then release it to fire. However, I got a few comments saying this probably is not the best way to handle this, and it might make people just prefer to aim and shoot manually. So now I made it to where the player can shoot and aim at different times, and it makes it feel a lot better and a lot more recognizable. Another feature I also added in for the shooting was I made it fully automatic. Well, sorta. I made it to where you could hold down the fire button and a roll of newspapers will be shot out consecutively instead of one at a time. Finally, I added a functionality to the spin. Beforehand, it was just a way for the player to fix their mistake when they jumped, and it just gave them some height. But now I made it to where if you spin attack, the player can actually break boxes and deal damage. The boxes can spawn things in like stamps or other stuff I really haven't thought of yet. I would say that I'm overall pretty happy with these changes that I've made, and over time, obviously this project is going to feel like a lot more of a complete game. However, there is one thing I would like to talk about that I think is worth addressing and that I want to take very seriously, and that is scope. One thing I need to remind myself is that I don't want to overburden myself with feature creep and other things that might slow down development. Right now I think Gooby's player controller feels really solid, to the point where I think level design might start coming into play. However, my original idea for this game was really small. I had a few small linear levels that were just one shot and call it a day. However, I have made some great progress, and I think that making more open-ended style levels is possible with the right amount of time and scope. I don't want my levels to be huge or overbearing to where I can't finish them at all, or they're empty and barrenless. But after all, I am a college student, and I'm 19 years old, so this already is a pretty big project. So I think in the next devlog, I'm going to talk about more about scope and how big the game's going to be and the more specifics of it. But I just kind of wanted to just touch on that topic right now. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for the support, and of course, stay safe.